at New York University, and she is the author of Communal Luxury, the Political Imaginary of the Paris Commune, May 68 and Its Afterlives, Fast Cars, Clean Bodies, Decolonization, and the Reordering of French Culture, as well as the emergence of social space, Rimbaud, and the Paris Commune. Her talk today is titled The Seventh Wonder of the ZAD.
Sorry, seventh wonder of the?
ZAD.
The ZAD, yes. This is the longest lasting political struggle in post-war French history. And I was invited there in 2016. It involves the occupation of a small stretch of farmland outside of the city of Nantes. And the occupation aimed at blocking the construction of an international airport on that site. So the ZAD, as it came to be known for reasons I'll go into, the occupants there had asked me to discuss with them the continuities and the discontinuities between the 1871 insurrection in the heart of the French capital, known as the Paris Commune, and what was occurring in their own occupation of these wetlands outside the village of Notre-Dame-des-Landes. So they were interested, as I am, in the form and practices of free communes and in questions of decentralizing and ways of creating a kind of regional self-sufficiency that is not a closing in on itself. Their interest in this 19th century event and the time that I subsequently have spent at the ZAD, including last week, was remarkable to me in a number of ways. For one thing, it reconfirmed something that I had argued in my book, Communal Luxury, that the return after 2011 throughout the world to a political strategy based on seizing space, rendering space public, had caused the commune to enter forcefully into the figuration of the present as a kind of laboratory of political inventions or a usable archive of legacy ideas and practices. And it had another effect of a historical nature as well. For me, it changed profoundly how I thought about the history of the recent past, in the sense that the ZAD made visible a whole alternative world history of the last half of the last century, a history in which place-based battles against government seizure or management of land emerged as the definitive battles of our age. So I'm thinking about recent occupational movements firmly anchored in a particular region, in a particular territory like the ZAD, or the pipeline struggles in the Americas like Standing Rock, and that how these current movements make it possible to see a distinctly new political sensibility emerging sometime toward the end of the last century. It is as if throughout the world people began to realize that the tension between the logic of development and that of the ecological bases of life had become the primary contradiction in their lives. And the Lars Act, which was a 10-year struggle in the 1970s of farmers in France and their supporters, fighting the government appropriation of their land to be used as an army training ground, or the equally lengthy and much more bloody battle of farmers on the outskirts of Tokyo, trying with the help of radical students to prevent their land from becoming the site of the Narita airport. These two 10-year battles can now be seen as among the most emblematic struggles of the second half of the 20th century in the following sense. The two movements mark the beginning of a political sensibility that brings together the will to change the social rules of an unequal world with that of preserving or conserving or caring for or defending simply the living, the ecological bases of society. So like the indigenously led land-based struggles that occur in the Americas and in Australia. These were, and elsewhere, these were movements that drew on political ecology, not in a particular environmentalist sense, but as a rethinking of and a challenge to the existing order of political relations of humans among themselves and to other organisms. And as such, they could not be dismissed as NIMBYism. They were the sign instead that the relations we maintain with the living world, with the living, would now be at the heart of any political movement of significance. In this sense, we could say that defending the conditions for life on the planet became, sometime around the middle of the last century, the new and incontrovertible horizon of meaning of all political struggle. So the ZAD's existence, which is as much a shared territory as a movement, with both aspects held equally dear, was thus for me a forceful reminder that to gain ground in the fight against enclosure, for this is what the fight is all about, we actually need to gain ground. We need to put our feet someplace, to remain someplace, to defend someplace, even if it is only a semi-arable stretch of land which the French government, when it designated it as the site of a future airport, consistently described, much to the surprise of the farmers living and cultivating there, they described it as a desert. Now, that's Narita again. Space-specific, geographically defined struggles have a kind of refreshing flat-footedness about them that has always appealed to me. David Harvey has suggested that this is because the fact of being bound to a particular space creates an either-or dialectic, which is something quite distinct from a transcendental or a Hegelian one. Demands, concerns, and aspirations that are space-specific in kind create a situation that calls for an existential choice. One is either for the airport or against it. In the words of Karl Marx to Vera Zasowicz, writing in the context of an earlier moral battle against the state, it is a question, quote, no longer of a problem to be solved, but simply of an enemy to be beaten. It is no longer a theoretical problem. It is quite simply an enemy to be beaten. A 57-kilometer tunnel will either be drilled through the Alps between Lyon and Turin for a high-speed train line, or it will not. An airport will either be built on farmland or it will not. What does it mean to create a territory, and what does it mean to defend one? And this is, I mean, my real question is, why is defending more generative of solidarity than what we're usually told to do, which is to resist, right? Why is defending a more pragmatic and far-reaching kind of activity? It may seem odd that someone like myself, I was trained in literature, should pose such a question, but it's not really surprising. The perception available, say, to a geographer on the one hand, or to an artist, or someone preoccupied by art, bears a significant overlap. For both, the physical environment can never be reduced to mere background or abstract space. The world, for both, can never be a warehouse of inert things piled up for later use. And so one of the reasons that throughout my work I think I've had such frequent recourse to geographical perspectives and ways of framing questions is that geography for me becomes a means of approaching landscapes with a sensitivity to what state boundaries obscure, unexpected natural formations and modes of life that spring up below the radar of authority. And the ZAD, as I came to learn, was nothing if not the creation of a kind of parallel world. So the slides are, I wonder if we could turn off these lights. You can't really see anything. It's a kind of map.
Oh, that's,
Yeah.
An experiment that reconfigures the lines of conflict of an era. And what I saw there could easily come under the heading of a commune in the making. There's another map. So these lines were the outline of the area that the government designated to become the airport. So the government set up the territory, and they called it a zone d'administration différée, like a zone, d'aménagement différé, ZAD. But when the occupiers came at the invitation of the farmers who refused to sell their land but needed help, they changed the sense of the term into a ZAD, zone à défendre. Communal practices, whether in Paris in 1871 or Chiapas today, imply staying in place and standing in the way, and by doing so, creating alternatives in the here and now, distinct, more or less self-reliant and semi-autonomous zones or territories. They embody the power of a collectivity with the ideal of self-determination and reliance. Taking a position, as Harvey's remarks make clear, is not just central to the issue, it is the issue. I accepted the invitation, I went down there, the visit was pretty extraordinary. We had this discussion about what's the relationship between the Paris Commune and the ZAD. Everything was interesting, but it wasn't, the French government at that time had dominated the media with images of the occupiers of the ZAD as kind of characters out of the Mad Max trilogy, and I discovered that there was no relationship really. I mean, there were all different kinds of people there, different experiences, different skills, and what we tried to do was to talk about the Paris Commune as an integral part of its own historical moment, but also in a way in which it exceeds its own history and can help us out, a kind of anticipation in act of all kinds of possibilities, so that even the projects that the communards couldn't complete, like federation or some of the other things they wanted to do, or an enduring regional self-sufficiency, could be seen to have profound significance for contemporary struggles like Notre-Dame-des-Landes. So, but what was surprising to me was not the discussion, it was the way that it unfolded. You know, I'm used to, like probably all of you, a certain kind of academic temporality, but what happened was that we couldn't really have the discussion because we had to wait for all the people that were up demonstrating against the labor laws in Paris to get back. And then we couldn't have it because we had to move a whole herd of cows from one side of the ZAD to another, and this was much more important than any discussion that we might have. And so by the end of we ended up waiting, and this is their bread making machines. We had it towards the end of the day, right when the bread was coming out, and so it was very nice. But what this anecdote is saying is it gives some idea of the interplay between manual labor and intellectual labor there, but it would just be a folkloric scene if the ZAD were not a place of struggle as well. And it's the revertibility between being a place of living, sharing a territory, and fighting that has made it such a thorn in the side of the government for so long. Now, it's clear that what matters for the world of international airports is a smooth and seamless transit between substitutable spaces. What matters for a territory? The making of a territory has everything to do with the logic of difference and possibility, autonomy and self-determination. Old, quite unfashionable notions like aura and authenticity associated with singularity come back into play, but with a difference. For if the ZAD has an aura, it has been constructed over time by the actions of many. Its authenticity created through the possibilities of common life that place-based social relations perpetuate, even amidst a striking diversity of beliefs and identities. And I want to come back to that later. The making of a territory is the making of a place that cannot be exchanged for any other. Where once the ZAD's fight was with the airport, over time it became no longer with high-speed transport per se, but with the world of high-speed transport, a world of class division that identifies human progress with economic growth and human needs in terms of markets and the submission of all the world's resources to markets. Preventing one's territory from becoming a mere node in a global capitalist system, a space of pure transit where people do nothing more than pass through, is a way of stabilizing in time and with luck a lifetime, a way of life that lies at least partially outside of and against the state and the market. So to return to the question I asked a little while ago, why defense and not resistance? Resistance means that the battle, if there ever was one, has already been lost. And we can only try helplessly to resist the overwhelming power that we attribute to the other side. Defending, on the other hand, means that there is already something on our side that we possess, that we value, that we cherish, and that is worth fighting for. Resistance unites a community by erecting a power to oppose, Donald Trump, for example, rather than forcing a community to interact with each other in a meaningful way and determine and decide what it really is about. Defending is more difficult and more fruitful to pursue to the extent that it obliges the community to think through what it is and isn't, not in identitarian ways, not in ideological ways, but rather according to what it values and considers worth defending. So I'm imagining that not many of you have the history of the ZAD fresh to your mind, so I'll give you a very brief history, which was that it really gets started, oddly enough, in 1968. That's when the government began to plan on building this airport, eventually, when they could drive all the farmers out over time. So they designated it, and they began to try to buy up all the land, and suddenly, these farmers were supposed to agree to self-designate as obsolete and just leave. And some of them refused to do this. So they were quickly joined by the nearby inhabitants that didn't want an airport. And these threw themselves energetically into, citizen actions, legal maneuvers. And then the squatters arrived in about 10 years ago. And from that point on, the ZAD became the ZAD. The acronym had a combative meaning, and the perimeter of the zone designated a set of battle lines. So I mentioned earlier that the primary difference separating the land-based struggles like Chiapas or Standing Rock, indigenously led, from those in Europe has to do with this very improbable assortment of very different components, different mixes of people. Old historic farmers, petty bourgeois shopkeepers, elected officials, black bloc anarchists, naturalists who don't even believe in farming. All of these groups together with no one in a leadership role. So no particular social group is in a leadership role, unlike, say, in the Americas where it's clearly the indigenous who are leading. So this is a very different kind of movement than those ideologically based struggles that we're familiar with in the history of the left. And it's a kind of movement that in its desire to hold together the diverse but equal components that make it up requires, as one dweller at the ZAD said, more tact than tactics. So And they call this kind of activity of trying to hold everyone together a kind of solidarity in diversity, right? So it's a solidarity that's not based on any sort of identity. They call it composition. And what it creates is a kind of working alliance, really, involving quite a bit of disidentification, and it's also the sharing of a physical territory, a living space. So composition is the mark of a massive investment in organizing life in common without the exclusions in the name of ideas, identities, or ideologies that we so frequently encounter in radical milieu. I mean, those of you that have spent any time on the left know that, you know, most of the time it's like someone is not black enough, someone is not a good enough Marxist, someone is a turncoat feminist, you know, because there's always exclusions going on. And this has, if the ZAD is perhaps the best example of an open conflict that has managed to endure, then it has everything to do with this process. So composition is really nothing more than the meeting up of separate worlds and the promise contained in the becoming commune of that meeting. So it's a place where even antagonisms create an attachment. So, and what this meant in practical terms is that you didn't spend any time trying to convince other parts of the movement of the superiority of your position. So you're not, you know, there were real nonviolent people there living right next to black bloc anarchists, or, you know, and everyone was sort of allowed to kind of pursue the way that they saw best. And this might include, you know, naturalists looking for all of the flora and fauna that, you know, that would be destroyed if the airport were built. So the strength of the movement derived precisely from its diverse makeup. And in the case of the ZAD, this also allowed it to express itself. Various kinds of actions, highway blockages using tractors, legal, people who just spent all of their time in the courtroom, violent demonstrations. So this is about the creation of solidarity in diversity, solidarity among people of disparate ideologies, identities, and beliefs, whose coming together and staying together adds up to no final orthodoxy, just a continuing internal eclecticism. That eclecticism and the disagreements it produces can be exhausting and aggravating, so why make the effort? Because the power of the movement resides in a certain excess, the excess of creating something that is more than the sum of ourselves, something that only the composition between our differences makes possible. So they were united by their opposition to the airport, and each group proceeded along its way for many years without trying to convert the others to the superiority of its practices. They were what the Zapatistas call a world where many worlds fit. And in 2012, the state launched a full-scale military invasion of the ZAD in a brutally violent and ultimately failed attempt to evacuate the zone and destroy the dwellings. And that was when the group began to think of themselves for the first time as a movement. The experience of the physical confrontation with the police during the one-month siege, the solidarity it engendered between groups that came to rely on each other, the 40,000 supporters that showed up at the end to help reconstruct the ZAD, cemented a community in struggle. So it is the ability of the ZAD, like the Lars Act and the Japanese anti-airport battle before it to have stabilized in time and to continue to fashion new and creative ways of inhabiting a conflict that is perhaps its most important characteristic. Its sheer duration. I mean, you can say it lasted 50 years, but in the kind of composition that I'm talking about is 10 years. But 10 years is a long time, and it's certainly a lot longer than shorter-lived occupations like Occupy or Madrid or Taksim, all of which, not coincidentally, are urban occupations. As Kropotkin pointed out in his rewriting of the Paris Commune in The Conquest of Bread, proximity to and involvement with the means of subsistence is essential not only to the duration of a movement, but to establishing a lived intimacy with the territory. And at the heart of that relationship is a form of embeddedness that undoes any distinction between dwelling in a territory and defending it. So the state invasion did much more than cement the various components of the struggle into a newly efficient coalition. It accelerated the community's knowledge of and visceral attachment to the territory in ways that could not be anticipated, making the very act of dwelling, of subsisting, of staying put, a more forceful political act. Any place owes its character to the experiences it affords to those who spend time there. And for these occupiers, this now included physical combat from atop trees, clouds of tear gas, their houses razed by tanks, the debris taken away to destroy any memory of their existence, as well as anything that could be used as a projectile against the police. What was now being defended was not farmland or wetlands. It included the new social links, the entanglements, the new physical relation to the territory, what Bachelard calls its muscular consciousness, that the battle had created, and the great enthusiasm and joy that came with victory because they essentially drove the army out again. Defending the territory now entailed defending the collective life project that had emerged there, a project that includes the very concept of territoriality to the extent that it fuses the spatial with the social, while nurturing a certain autonomy and will to self-determination. The territory offers the possibility of acting on the real in a manner that is at once convivial, transgressive, and pragmatic. It creates mobilization out of demobilizing. And what is revolutionary about the ZAD and its inhabitants is not so much their opposition to the airport as their discovery over time about what it is that they were for, what they had to defend. And this came largely from the experience of anchoring themselves in a symbiotic entanglement of people and place, best summed up by a slogan that I saw first at the ZAD, but now I see it in all sorts of any kind of sort of climate or ecological movements. This is some of their dwellings. Nous sommes la nature qui se défend. We are not defending nature, we are nature defending itself. Which is essentially a rephrasing of the communard geographer Élisée Reclus' statement, man is nature becoming conscious of itself. Now, one of the major effects of capital is to make us disconnected from the living, transforming us into people without places, endlessly uprooted and uprootable according to the vicissitudes of the economy. And the idea that there is only one world is in fact the essence of capital. The world as it exists is the lone referential basis for what is possible. The question then becomes how to cultivate a point of view that is not that of the economy, how to get out of the impasse of political economy and its critique, For even the critique of political economy keeps us locked in the unique world of capital, and thus participates in the eradication of the plurality of worlds. When we say that the ZAD makes dwelling or inhabiting into a more forceful political act, we are saying that to think our lives from the perspective of where we live, inhabiting a place and being inhabited by it, is one way to cultivate a point of view that does not begin and end with economic productivity. As a group from the ZAD recently put it, if it has become so crucial for the political classes to crush the ZAD, it is because the ZAD constitutes an insolent demonstration of a life that is possible without them, a better life. A better life, certainly, for those fleeing the very real aggravations of life in capitalist culture. But the kind of freedom experienced there is more than just the negative freedom of retreat from an unjust world into a culture of consolation. It is a launching point, which is to say that it figures a more positive and actively experimental sort of freedom. What's interesting about spending any time there is that time really moves according to these task-oriented works rather, of course, than salaried labor in a world where the positive impacts of high-speed travel have long ago been dismissed as a myth. The practical business of living, building structures, caring for the animals, cultivating the fields, organizing the library, does not make for the narrowness of focus that you might think. During one of my visits there, the occupiers were busy building a lighthouse in the middle of the ZAD, and when I saw it, well, you know, the ocean was nowhere near. So I said, why a lighthouse? You know, why? Is it defensive? Is it to be able to see the cops when they come? And they said, no, it's communal luxury. It's the seventh wonder of the ZAD. So that phrase, communal luxury, which was the title of a book I wrote about the commune, occurs in the closing sentence of the manifesto, which was a manifesto that created a we and a them, communards versus anti-communards. And it was a manifesto written also to consolidate the artists of the commune into a single federation. And in so doing, they really overturned the hierarchy at the core of the artistic world, the hierarchy that granted enormous privilege and status and financial advantage to fine artists, and this was a status that you know, decorative artists, lace makers, people who made porcelain, they couldn't share it. And so this was a way of saying there's really only one artistic intelligence and everybody participates in it. When Eugène Potier, who of course wrote L'Internationale, and the other artists and artisans meant by communal luxury was something like creating public beauty, enhancing the lived environment in villages and towns, and you could say that it meant the right of every person to live and work in a pleasing environment. And this might sound not very demanding, and yet if you think about it, it actually entails a complete reconfiguration of our relationship to art, to labor, to social relations, to nature, and to the lived environment as well. It means art and beauty deprivatized and fully integrated into everyday life. The world is divided between those who have and those who don't have the luxury of playing with words and images. Communal luxury overcomes that division. And it's, in other words, a full dismantling under the commune of socially determined and ancient categories of artistic practices. There's the lighthouse when it got better. And this is Napoleon Gaillard a shoemaker and a drunk, who was put in charge of barricade construction during the Commune. And he received a lot of contempt from anti-communards because they thought he was vain, you know, and then they called him the Père des Barricades, and they castigated, they called this particular barricade the Chateau Gaillard, and they accused him of considering the barricades he worked to be at once works of art and luxury, which in fact he did. They were right, because he always arranged to have himself photographed in front of any of his barricades, in effect signing them as works of art. So communal luxury, as it was practiced during the Commune, or the ZAD, this is the carpentry atelier at the ZAD, is thus a way of constituting an everyday aesthetics of process, the act of self-emancipation made visible. At the ZAD, self-inventions a la Napoleon Gaillard are frequent, and identities are often blown to smithereens. And what seems in communal luxury in the Commune, what seems initially like a decorative demand on the part of a number of decorative artists, is in fact a call for nothing short of the total reinvention of what counts as wealth, what a society values, what it is willing to defend. It's a call for the reinvention of wealth beyond exchange value and the end of luxury founded on class difference. Now, it's interesting to point out that when the French version of my book came out, Communal Luxury, I had a disagreement with the editor about the French title. I just wanted to call it Luxe Communal, which not only is a direct it's the citation, it's the words that the communards themselves use. And my editor said, no, you can't call it that, because French people today, when they hear the adjective communal, the only thing they think of is municipal swimming pools or really boring local elections. So this won't work at all. And yet, here was proof that he was wrong, that here was the material and conceptual evidence that the aspirations and achievements to which artisans of the Paris Commune in the last century gave the name communal luxury was not only firmly grasped by the French and others today, but were being thoughtfully and creatively furthered, lived, and cultivated in a small bocage on the outskirts of Nantes. So, just to conclude, the ZAD was victorious. In January of this year, of 2018, the Macron government announced that no airport would be built. But the same government proved its obsession with annihilating any life lived differently by ordering at the cost of 400,000 euros a day, another military-style invasion involving 3,000 police and soldiers in tanks to be launched into the zone to destroy all the dwelling places and communal buildings that the occupiers, who were very intent on continuing the kind of communist experiments in collective farming that they had developed over living together for 10 years, that all had to be destroyed. And this is an interesting picture of the people at the ZAD collected all of the spent grenades that were used in this invasion. You can see the quantity. And they brought them and dumped them in front of the mayor's office in Nantes. And they were arrested for littering. The scale of the military offensive against the ZAD is one measure of the threat that the government perceived in the occupiers' collective exit from salaried labor and consumer gratification. The threat, too, in the appeal, the world that they were building, held to the thousands of people who came to support them, with some of them deciding to stay put and themselves make a life there. Government intransigence, combined with the military occupation of the zone, created an insurmountable division among the occupiers between those. This is what happened after the victory, that there was a kind of a civil war. in the ZAD between those who wanted to stay and continue on in this kind of collective farming and those who refused any negotiation with the state. So these really sort of hardcore nihilistic anarchists who said no conversation with the state. And these were the ones that were expelled by the state. And the others were sort of, have been allowed to stay, and it's unclear, you know, in what form at this point. And so a different phase of the struggle has unfolded as they try to secure the different habitations and practices that they've developed over the years. There's a little fresco. And cultivate new initiatives in the battle against development for development's sake. Thanks. Yes?
There's something marvelous and moving and wonderful about your account of this social experiment and the way that it worked. And of course, elements of it are being replicated all across the world. I can think of so many cases in India where the possession of land, particularly forest lands, and the displacement of people is the form in which the state and big capital is actually moving against life itself, including the environment. But precisely because it's all these things, you wonder how it can become a model for something larger than itself or its occasional capacity to mobilize people to offer alternative visions of life and then to end. So I wonder if in your thinking about these kinds of occasions, you have models of thought, of being, that emerge from there that are expandable into, I don't know, different conception of political possibility?
Well, I think you're asking how can a movement that by definition is rooted in a particular place?
I don't want to think of it only as a movement because you're doing so much more with it.
Yeah.
Who thinks of decorative arts when you're thinking about the dispossession of land? You're modeling a different way of imagining being and belonging in a space.
Yeah.
So I'm asking you to sort of do more with that.
Well, I guess it does come back to forms of association and federation. And one of the things that strikes me about spending any time there is that, for example, there's a very intimate relationship with Chiapas that they've developed and maintained. Some people come over from there, they go over to Mexico. The same with, say, the movement against the railroad line that I mentioned in northern Italy, the NOTAV movement. Intimate exchanges go on. So I think I would look to that kind of a, not so much necessarily an expansion in that way, but more a kind of federation of these smaller territories into something else, some kind of a, I don't want to use the word network, but I don't know what to call it. I would call it federation, which is an old anarchist idea, but, and it's exactly what was at the heart of the communal desire to see themselves as an entity outside of the nation, but in an international horizon. And I think that's true of these kinds of occupations.
Yeah, I found this really fascinating and wonderful, and also very moving. I mean, one thing that is at work is if, this is a kind of version of the propaganda of the deed, but it's one that is also aided by social media and those new possibilities for global networks. Of course, it also undermines the importance of social media because it,
they're not really involved in social media.
No,
No, they're not like the Gilets Jaunes.
Oh, okay. But I'm thinking of Occupy, for instance, its connections to Madrid, to Greece, and then, some years later, Taksim Square, you mentioned, the Hong Kong movement. You know, there are these different ways in which these groups are both really very singular in their connection to a place, but at the same time, there is a new idiom that is emerging, and it's very interesting. I happened to be in Istanbul when Taksim was happening, spectacularly enough, at a conference on crowds and violence. And the Turkish participants were showing up literally bruised and coughing from tear gas. It was quite incredible. But something that I wanted to ask you about is, in some ways, like are there any structures of governance? So, you know, one of the things that I think is very fascinating about the Occupy phenomenon was this idea that you're not just occupying the space and, you know, kind of defending or resisting by being inert, but it also became a kind of space of a kind of, you know, as David Graeber would say, you know, kind of prefigurative politics, you know, kind of new model of consensus making, deliberative democracy, and this kind of thing. And so there was this attempt to create a kind of model experiment in a very deep conception of democracy. And so I'm wondering, you know, within that extraordinary diversity that you described, how are, like, inevitably certain decisions must be made collectively. How are those decisions made?
At these endless general assemblies.
So
endless.
Yeah.
You know, and they're really, I mean, I'm talking about meetings that are 6 hours long, with everyone speaking and everyone, you know, and it's there that you see that there's really no one in charge. Except, I would say that the historic farmers, the ones who didn't sell their land and who got the whole thing going in the first place, had a certain, I mean, if there was any kind of hierarchy, there was the respect for them. And you can almost say that in their historic relationship to the land and working the land, they almost play the same role as the indigenous people in the Americas. I know I'll get a lot of pushback about that, but I don't know, you know, I mean, so yes, these processes, and also inevitably they had to figure out what to do with people that were just sort of antisocial and that weren't contributing in any way, and how to get rid of them, you know, so they had to do all of that. And then to deal with problems that seem very trivial, like dogs. And dogs, I mean, took up so much of the discussion, and it was because so many people felt that there they were living in a free zone, so their dogs should run free. This is really a deeply felt thing. And then otherwise, but, you know, other people were trying to herd their sheep, and the dogs would screw up the sheep, and so there was a lot of division. There was a lot, I mean, there was a lot of division, you know. I mean, they had to overcome a lot of not just identitarian kinds of divisions, but really the stuff that comes up when you share space.
And did those general assemblies aim at consensus, like the Occupy movement did, or was it eventually a vote?
Yeah, I would say they aimed at consensus.
I want to come back to the dogs here. So, because it seems to me that something that is taking place here is a battle for rights, and it's a shift to rights of nature. Was that much of the discussion that was taking place? In other words, giving of rights to other than humans in the construction of this commune?
Not explicitly. I don't know if rights
language. We are not defending nature, we are nature defending itself. It implies that the agent here is nature.
Yeah. Yeah, but I'm not sure. I don't remember any language that relied on rights. That's all I'm saying. I don't know what follows from that, but I don't remember that vocabulary, but yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this talk. I was thinking, I mean, I know more from
research on the Zapatistas, and when I think about the history of that movement, which has really put forward autonomy as a revolutionary praxis, but didn't emerge that way, and emerged more as an armed revolutionary movement with declaring war on the state, and went through really extensive negotiations with the state, and then kind of autonomy develops as after that, and that there's been so many critiques from leftists of them for taking this position, right, of not only of not engaging in kind of bourgeois political institutions like through elections and things like that, but also the kind of the limited nature of even though they've made really clear that they want to be that they want an international projection of the kind of values of the movement, and I guess my question, it relates a little bit more to Sue Beers, is at what point is the idea of the federation among these different, these movements and these occupied spaces going to be limited by just the, inevitable, encroachment of capital on these territories aided by incredibly violent states that will throw people off, and is that do you see a possibility of connecting these kind of movements then with a broader struggles for, let's say, taking state power, or at least working with states? Or do you think that's that needs to be considered, or do you see these as really separate strategies? Or
I don't. It's the people there were not self-enclosed. They were constantly. For example, they were very involved in the labor struggles in Paris. They were going up and fighting in those and doing all of that. So it's not as though they saw themselves as in a space that had, completely seceded from the state or anything like that. But as far as overcoming the state, I don't know. I don't think that was really a goal of any kind. I think it's closer to what's come to be known as, dual strategy, or the idea that you do a kind of semi-secession, you become much more self-reliant, and in so doing, you're going to eventually render those state structures redundant because you don't need them anymore. So they did last for 10 years. I mean, which is a big chunk of someone's life. There were babies born. There were grandmothers involved. Everything. So it's about also having a life. Yeah. And creating the life that you want within the limitations allowed by the market and the state. So it's a halfway measure. I mean, you could say, I'm really interested now in, it seems to me that there's like three kind of people in France. And the first kind are the people like us who essentially know how to game the system, and we're doing okay, right? And we're in it, critical as we might be. And then there are people like the people at the ZAD who are actually trying to live differently. And that's something else. And now we have the Gilets jaunes. And they're 100% in the system too. They just want a better distribution. They want more of what capital has to offer. So you can have solidarity certainly with them, but they aren't really the same as attempting to live differently, although it's beginning to happen to them in the course of the movement because of these strange, creations that they make at the rotaries when they meet up and, talk to each other and have meals together and build things together.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I was in Taksim Square as well when protests were happening, coughing out that gas, and since then, since before Occupy, I was here as well, that was the first time that I came. Since then, I have been dealing with the questions that such kind of temporary occupations opened, and practically looking for places that such examples like durable ones can can happen, and trying to understand what was so powerful at the same time, even though it ended up being crushed, what was so powerful about those mobilizations. One of them being giving an alternative, like having such kind of alternative to the current hegemonic realism in a certain way. And when I read your book about communal luxury, and that concept stuck with me, it was such a powerful tool in a way for me to understand what actually has happened and what appealed to me in both of those mobilizations at the time. And that understanding that the divisions of labor of art we are so accustomed to does not apply in the alternative world, that alternative socialism that's being lived there, really stuck with me. And that together with a certain conception of or certain feeling of time, a different lack of urgency that we tend to have. And you actually mentioned a number of times that this difference of temporality and difference of priority realization in terms of that. So a little bit, sorry, I kind of dragged it along, but so my question is was this: in terms of this different creation of temporality, different experience of temporality, and the non-specialized division of labor that is experimented with and struggled with, that was created in such kinds of in ZAD, in this example. I was wondering in such context, doing thinking, writing, doing theory, in your view and in your observation and experience, was it qualitatively different as well?
Well, I translated a book that some of the occupiers wrote, La Mauvaise Troupe, and it's just called the ZAD and Notov, and it came out from Verso. And one big difference is that they wrote it as a collective. So I don't know how they did it, but you know, they are anonymous and they wrote it as a collective. But at the same time, it bears no relationship to another kind of anonymous, radical, theoretical production that we know called the Invisible Committee, maybe in France. In that what they did was really assemble the voices of the people that created the two movements, and they wove them together, the Italian one and the French one. And they, so that it's quite a different kind of theoretical, pursuit, because the theory is indistinguishable from the people that have made the movement, so that there is no meta theory. I mean, they're producing it as the movement endures. So that they talk about things like composition and what it involves, what they mean by trying to, simply get along in these situations and invent new ways to get along as the years go by. I mean, I'm fascinated by what you said about, say, the difference between these kind of quick, punctual things like Taksim and stuff, and things like the Narita movement was the same thing. That went on for 10 years, and it was so violent and bloody, and it again had to do with the composition of these very distinct groups, these urban kids from Tokyo who had never in their life given a thought to where their food came from, with these farmers who, started out just trying to defend a way of life, but in the process learned what violence the state is capable of, to try to destroy them. So that, and yet they too, just invented all these ways to keep going and to have a life that was also a life of fighting. Yeah, in the back.
Quick question. I'm an activist as well, and one of the founders of a movement in Israel Palestine called the Academy for Equality. And one of the founding principles of this movement is taken actually from radical lesbian groups in Latin America of the 1970s, talking about the principle of solidarity between struggles. And it sounds very similar to your description of composition, but it sounds slightly different in the way it's organizing temporality and spatiality in these terms. I was wondering if there's any relation, that's one big question relating to that, and the other is, whether you see any relation to the kind of Hart and Negri model of breaking temporal and spatial boundaries in the relationship, or how one struggle learns from another, which Hart and Negri kind of try to encompass as one global movement and countering, the globalization, etc., etc.
I don't think Hart and Negri are big on their reading list, nor on mine. But what did you say before then?
So the solidarity between struggles rather than a process of composition.
Yeah, composition really has to do with creating this kind of working alliance among very different kinds of people in a single shared space. So I suppose you could take that farther and turn it into a model of federation, except that in some way all of these struggles are quite similar because they're land-based. And at this point, we know that by the middle of this century, the amount of arable land per person is going to be 25% of what it was in 1970. So it is really about, defending the land.
Kristin, can I just ask you, I know it's about a year ago that the Macron regime brutally intervened in the ZAD and once again failed. I've read very mixed reports on the situation in the ZAD today. You alluded to it very briefly in your conclusion.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what your general assessment of life on the ZAD post the most recent Macron intervention is like?
It's metamorphosizing again, it's changing. They're becoming, by necessity, normal, in that those who stayed, well, for one thing, I didn't mention this, but everyone who was involved in the movement took the same name, Camille, which is a name that's either male or female, in French, and then no one had a real name. Now they have to have names. The government demanded that those who wanted to stay sign, a paper filling out a form saying clearly what part of the land they wanted and what they were going to do there, and it had to be an agricultural project. So they got around that by refusing to do it individually. They proposed collective projects for everything, and it was a very tense negotiation with the government. And in the meantime, the government came in a second time and just got rid of all of the people that refused to speak to them. So those people now are incredibly angry and have denounced those who stayed as compromised and turncoats and that kind of. So it's that kind of a war between the ones who stayed and the ones who left, and the ones who were driven out by the government. So the government successfully did divide and conquer. They divided the group up into the group that stayed together all those years. They became two distinct groups, and the people that have stayed, they formed a cooperative, a little bit like other existing, sort of vernacular communal forms like Longo Mai. Do you know those people that started in Switzerland or Germany and now have places all over the world, actually in Latin America as well, that are just these, essentially these large commune movements. So they went through a really bad period, but now they've managed to stay. And in a way, now the government needs them because for greenwashing. There's a question here.
Yeah. So I was thinking about the comparison with the no-tap movement in the Susa Valley in Italy. And in that case, in Italy, the repression has happened not only with military occupation or legal battles, but also in the media, like representing these people who were active as people from the mountains who are backwards and don't believe in progress or science, and anti-technology. And so in that case, like what really worked against the movement was this rhetoric, the public rhetoric, and also the fact that not even political parties on the left were willing to support the Valdisusa movement. So I was wondering if this is the case also in France with the ZAD.
Yeah, it was pretty much the case. The support that they got came from just from ordinary people. Whenever they had a very violent altercation with the state, thousands and thousands of people, French and otherwise, would go there and they would be welcomed and they would help rebuild. And so there was a lot of popular support, but nowhere near as much popular support as in the Susa Valley because that's like 70,000 people. The ZAD at its most was only about 400 people. And so that I see that as I understand what you're saying about the media representation and the way that worked against them, but they had a lot of people, the whole Susa Valley was pretty much given over to the no-tap movement. There were antis, of course, but it was an extremely popular movement in the region, and the region was much larger than the ZAD. Yeah. Gary?
Yeah, thank you. I've talked about this before, it's just as exciting. And heterogeneity is so fascinating, and I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about who reached out to you specifically within this kind of force field of differences, because you gave us this sense of solidarity and differences, and you said they talked to me. Who they were and whether it was started with the translation came later. They started by wanting to talk about the commune, like who reached out to you and what was that? Why you?
They had been reading Communal Luxury, a bunch of them, and so they invited me to just talk about it, and then I did the translation of their book and wrote preface for it.
They a mix of farmers, black bloc, anarchists, bystanders, natural. You gave us all of this.
Well, some elements of that were all there.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I was very struck by the similarity that you drew to the Narita airport protests, and I was actually lucky enough to see you speak a little bit about that, or at least in the Japanese 1968 contest in Waseda 3 years ago.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
So I happened to be there at that time, but what I do with a lot of my work, which compares France and Japan as well, is the similarity of the kind of political and geopolitical situation of both of those two states in the late 60s and early 70s. And it makes me think that it's perhaps only in countries like France and Japan where that kind of longitudinal, struggle could be possible, as opposed to even places like the United States, with because as you know, and as you've written, it was really, although it was very violent, and 68 was violent in both cases, it wasn't as violent as it could have been. So I was wondering then what you see the limitations of this kind of radical communal luxury could be, even though these are such fascinating kind of structures and historical situations, there seems to be a limit, right, in terms of what is possible within capital. right? And within the different geopolitical structures and situations, so what then?
Well, I think that what these things show is that capital and the state take naps, and a lot can be done when they're taking a nap. And that's in fact what happened with the ZAD, because the government forgot to build the airport for about, between throughout the 80s and 90s. So there was a 20-year period where it just put it on the back burner or forgot about it. And they were waiting for the farmers to die, really. And they didn't die, and and instead they consolidated an opposition. But yeah, I think that this napping phenomenon, you can see it in other places in rural France where, and probably Japan, I don't really know, but where these are really quite forgotten areas that don't have much value, market value to them, but where there's an enormous amount going on in these places in like the Cévennes or the Ardennes, these mountainous places in rural France where people are really living very, very differently. They are, for just to give you an example of what they're doing is that a house becomes available in a community, in a village or a region, and these people have no money, but they put their money together and they buy the house so that it doesn't get bought by, a Parisian or something. And then they rent it to a family that will stay. So that, you're really fighting against that desertification of the countryside. And you're also bringing together people that are going to do things like, cut wood together, all that kind of stuff. So it's about sort of the survival of these vernacular commune forms in the countryside that, especially in the case of the ZAD, it has a direct relationship to the history of radical agriculture in that specific region that, involved the Lars Act, and involves figures like Bernard Lambert, so it is very deeply rooted. All right. Thank you.